Artificial intelligence is changing the workplace faster than most organizations appreciate. We're no longer talking about AI helping employees write emails or summarize meetings. And honestly, if that's all you're using it for, you're at least 6 months behind. Algorithms are increasingly influencing who gets hired, how people are managed, what they're paid, who gets promoted, and of course, which people get fired. At the same time, millions of employees are quietly bringing AI into their own work, often without their employer's knowledge or approval. And at the same time, governments and regulators are still trying to determine where responsibility actually sits when an algorithm makes or influences a decision that changes someone's career. I'm Dominic Bowen, and I'm host of the International Risk Podcast, where we talk about the topics that really matter. Today's guest is Andrew Adams. He's chair of the Labour and Employment Practice Group at Darrow Everett, and he advises organisations on employment law, workplace investigations, regulatory compliance, government enforcement, and he's going to help us explore how AI is fundamentally changing power, accountability, and trust within organisations. And these are the issues that CEOs, board members, human resources, risk, and employees are increasingly having to navigate. Andrew, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
No, thank you for having me. Very excited to talk about this today. I know it's a to-date, up-to-date topic, and it's a very exciting place to be in.
Yeah, it definitely is. And tell us, Andrew, whereabouts are you based?
So I'm based out of our Boston office, and live in Providence, so I do that little commute up there. But been there for about 6 years now.
Decisions, and I don't think most employees or many executives really fully appreciate the influence that algorithms are having within their organizations and within their customers' organizations. So, Andrew, can you tell us how far down the path are we already, and what employment decisions are already being shaped by AI more than we even realize?
No, of course. And so I think you have a couple of different schools of thought from employers. And so you have, early adoption employers who are now into a phase of automation, and more beyond implementing, whether it's Claude or ChatGPT or an engine for their use, and they're more into automating processes and things like hiring. And we'll get a little bit more into that. But the other side of it is you still have a good amount of employers who haven't fully adopted AI into the business cycle, the employment cycle, and they're still in that exploratory phase, like you were just talking about. It's, oh, this is an interesting search engine tool, but I haven't really adopted it beyond that for, Microsoft Office integrations, building it into our hiring processes, even into automating document review and things like that. And, coming from the law firm side, which are notoriously slow adopters of new tech, you've seen a lot quicker adoption here in this space than you have in the past, with changes in the legal realm. But you still have that kind of flux in between too, of employers who are like looking at whether or not they can build in these automation processes, what actually helps them. And then you have, those early adopters too, who are now moved into automation. And then some you see are pulling back a little bit based on cost, token usage, and things of that nature, and trying to figure out where that sweet spot is for what automates processes, what builds onto what your company is doing, what saves cost overall, and what can be effective. And in that realm, then you get into, what is the algorithm doing? And, do we have insight into the background processes that are occurring to make sure that we're compliant, especially on the labor and employment side, which is where I live. And you build into those issues where you might, be pulling wrong demographics and things like that. And the algorithm's processing raw data, but it's not really understanding fully what it's excluding and what candidates it's excluding, for example. But yeah, so that's kind of where the status of where we are.
Political race. And I wonder, from an employee and an employment and a workplace point of view, if AI does, from where you sit, if AI does continue to accelerate at the same trajectory we've seen over the last couple of years, what does that mean for the workplace? What does that mean for all of us as employees and managers and leaders? Where will we be in 2027?
Yeah, well, I think you see a lot more impact in jobs like mine, in the the traditional white collar space, where you have a lot of that cognitive workflow coming through. legal realm, banking, finance, across the board. You're going to see those tools. There's going to be a push to implement those tools, but then there's also the sort of bottleneck that we're seeing now too, is because with the release of the latest models, the frontier models that they have out now, was the first time the federal government at least really got involved in regulation of AI to an extent. So you saw some of that pullback from those releases that came out originally, especially with Fable and the Mythos engines. And so there's a little bit more push for regulation at that point. There's a little bit more push from regulation from the states as well, if you look at the United States and outside of that in the EU, based on the release of those latest models, because they see that, while it is a great advance and it's an amazing tool that can push the world as a whole forward, there's also those risks and dangers that are involved too that become more apparent with the latest frontier models. So you see a little bit more pushback on those. And in the employment world, it's all about, at the end of the day, cost when you're looking at a company as a whole. So the larger the company, the greater the cost reduction effort goes. So you become a balancing act, and it looks back and forth at what's my human labor cost versus what's the engine cost. And as you can see with some of the new frontier models that have that ability, the cost is monumentous as opposed to some of the older models that come through. So I think at some point you're going to see a bottleneck between token usage, cost, and development, and look at more refinement of when those tools are going to be implemented, as opposed to a great replacement kind of theory of employers. Um, so less, overall layoff impact, I think, on the most impressive frontier models, as opposed to some of the, automation that may happen with some of the older models there. And I think, power consumption, energy consumption, water consumption, you're going to see a little bit of limitation as well.
I think most of us recognize, as we've already alluded to, that AI is not just about writing emails or generating presentations, but it very quickly will be able to move into negotiating contracts, managing projects, writing software, conducting research, making strategic recommendations, and even supervising other AI systems. And I've got a couple of clients now that are already rolling that out. They've got AI systems and they've got other AI systems on top of them that are supervising them and quality assuring them. And I think it suggests quite confidently that organizations may be able to replace entire levels of junior or middle management, while a single employee equipped and knowledgeable to deploy AI could become 10 or 100x times more productive than today. And I think if even half of that turns out to be true, we're not talking about incremental change. We're talking about, the largest transformation of the labor market since the Industrial Revolution, except that the Industrial Revolution didn't touch everyone. This does touch everyone. So, Andrew, from an employment law, from a governance perspective, from a societal perspective, do you think our organizations, do you think our legal systems, our employee frameworks, employment frameworks, are they even remotely prepared?
So I don't think they are. And I don't think, for a majority of employers, for a majority of states, commonwealths, and governing nations, there's not really that preparation for that kind of global and massive change and shift in the employment market. And for the employers themselves that are adopting it and building into it, they are building into a space like you just discussed, where succession planning into the next level of employees coming through, that's not happening in some scope. So we've worked with clients, had discussions with law firms at forums where they've built into this system their AI integrated model, and there are firms out there now that are AI engineers with attorneys that review the work that gets processed by the AI and the AI engineering team. And a similar scope too, you have some kind of we'll call it like a fragmented system of a law firm where it's just partners with books of business that now operate on the AI models without building in associate classes in some spaces. So you're building this network and this system where you have established senior leaders in companies, or established senior leaders breaking off from companies and forming their own companies, where it's a network of those established individuals, and they're building in AI tools as opposed to building in the next generation of employees. So you're going to see this great stretching gap in training, especially employee training and succession planning. So how that works out at the end of the day, I don't think anyone's prepared for or thinking through at that point, because you have a large group of thought leaders, large group of the drivers, rainmakers, as we call them in the legal world, and others, that are building out these practices. that don't have any succession planning.
Yeah, and I think that's a risk, and I think there's been a lot of conversation about that, and so I might even shift the conversation a little bit to people in their mid career. Now, if we talk about the senior business leaders, people in their 50s and 60s, by the time this really hits, they will probably have retired. There's been a lot of conversation about people entering the workforce, but what about people in the middle of their career, people in their 30s or 40s that that means this is going to hit when they're in their 50s, which is a notoriously difficult time to make a career transition. What should they be doing today if there's even a reasonable chance that this could materialize? I mean, it's all well and good to say learn a skill, but if you're speaking to someone who's in their 40s, they've had a good career, they're a middle manager, they work in a white collar job, do you really expect them to go and do an apprenticeship on to be a plumber or an air conditioning repair person? What's your advice to them?
So I would just say that this is, AI is not going anywhere. It is a technology and it's an adaptation in the workplace, just like it is an adaptation in outside the workplace in everybody's daily lives. It's the same thing as, moving from landlines to smartphone or cell phones and then to smartphones. Um, there's a lot of jobs now that require you to have your smartphone, be able to log in. You have dual factor authentication to log into your platforms and things like that. It all becomes second nature. So the big push is to learn the new technology, understand AI to an extent. You don't have to understand the algorithm or the coding behind it or things like that in many, workplaces, but you do have to have kind of a fundamental understanding of what it can and can't do, what the risks are, and look at the workplace that you're in, the profession that you're in, and how it's being used in your profession. So, understand how it's advancing your profession, where it's going to be utilized, and get a little bit of a background in that and how you can implement it too. Because, now, I mean, 5, 10 years, it's going to be ingrained across the board like any other technology that has come into play, but well beyond the capabilities of anything that we've ever had. Um, but right now is the time to make sure that you are, they call it AI native, and just being able to have an understanding of how it's going to be used in your job and understanding how to do that. Because, 10, 15 years from now, there may not be succession planning, but you are going to be there. You're already most likely ingrained in your workplace if you're in your 30s or 40s, if you've been there for a significant period of time, and into your profession. So you're an experienced professional. This is the next step of your craft across the board, and just having a basic understanding of what AI can do and how it can help you day to day is that's going to be fundamental.
And I think, one of the biggest changes isn't coming from executives and business leaders. It's coming from employees. It's coming from those early adopters, people doing exactly what you just recommended, understanding and learning the tools. And I think millions, or I know that millions of people are already using ChatGPT. They're using Claude, they're using coding assistants, and they're using a variety of other AI tools around marketing, around financial analysis. The use cases just go on, but they're often doing so without approval, simply because they want to work faster, they want to work better. Sometimes there's that expectation, sometimes there's that frustration that management is too slow, management doesn't understand the technology, so employees just start utilizing it. Where is the balance between legitimate innovation? Where does that end, and where does misconduct begin?
So I think it depends on the industry, and what we see with a lot of clients is a failure to train their employees across the board. So it starts with the employer training their employees. So a good training program, a good knowledge-based program about what AI can and can't do, what the risks are, and what the limitations are for your company and your specific workforce is essential to any employer. Uh, Whether or not they want to use AI or whether or not they want to automate anything, or if they're pulling back and they're not implementing AI across the board, you need to educate your employees on it because they are going to use AI. There's nothing that stops them from going on their phone and using AI, going on their personal computer. You can have some things in place for compliance on your own systems, but beyond that, your employees are going to use it. So training is fundamental there, and understanding the scope of what can and can't be done there, and the controls that you can have in place is so essential for any workforce. And given the tools that are out there now, especially with let's say Cloud Compliance API and being able to track what's going in there and limit confidential information, HIPAA protected information, personal information that shouldn't be disclosed there is very, very important. So, training and implementing a tool for your employees to use is one of the ways to stop that, use of shadow AI or the AI on the side that's not being tracked by the company. So, and understanding implementation in some sort, and heavy training on that is extremely important, because when we're looking at some enterprise systems that are out there and available for employees, that's where you have those controls in place and that hold back of that confidential information. So we don't want that training on that confidential data or client data, patient data, for example. And those systems exist, but you need to be knowledgeable about that as an employer, and you need to teach your employees about that, because the big risk comes from taking that privileged information, that extremely confidential information, health protected information, putting it into an outside model, just a browser AI model that's going to train on that data and absorb that. So that's the high risk, because you get into data breach risk, you get into patient confidentiality risk, privilege waiver. So that kind of training, understanding what they can and can't do and what can go where, are the most important things to train employees on right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Whenever a colleague or an employee makes a mistake, I always say to the responsible manager, first of all, did we have a good, a reasonable, and a policy that people can comply with? And then, secondly, did we train people on that policy? Did we give them the skills and the knowledge to understand with it, to comply with it, and just that repeat, not just once, but continually? Is it something we speak about? Is it something we enforce? We go back when we talk about performance reviews? Are we looking at the relevant and most important policies? And where we're seeing gaps or concerns, do we provide additional training? And training, of course, can take many different shapes and forms. But in many cases, I say, look, if the policy wasn't great, if the training wasn't great, it's not the employee's fault. It's our fault as the leadership team. And I think that's something that a lot of employers, they're quick to point the employee, but no, I think more often it's the leadership team that needs to take responsibility, get better policies in place and better training for your staff. So I wholeheartedly agree with what you said, Andrew.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And you'll see what you see mostly in the media and in the news is about, an employee putting in X amount of information that was privileged information, or, confidential trade secret information into an external system. But you never hear about the background of what was in place. Were they using a model? Were they using a model for certain, aspects of work interior, and they thought logging into a browser externally was under the same protections? And is there a gap in that employee training? And it's essential that your employees have an understanding of how these models operate, what's safe to do, and what has the highest risk.
Again, Andrew. And Andrew, I'll take an opportunity to remind our listeners that if you prefer to watch your podcasts, please go to YouTube and search for the International Risk Podcast. And if you like our content, please subscribe and maybe consider sharing it with a friend or colleague. It's really great for people to hear about the work that we're doing here at the podcast and the great content from our guests. And Andrew, ironically, we've been talking about the risks, and AI doesn't just create risks. As with all risks, there's opportunities, and AI creates incredibly capable of employees. And I've seen many junior employees. I've seen many junior employees lean unreasonably on AI, but I've seen other employees, equipped with great tools and trained on these tools and aware of what they can and cannot do with them, perform work that previously would require much, much more senior staff to perform. So I've seen some junior employees produce some fantastic work in partnership with different AI tools. How do you think AI is going to change expectations around people's performance, around recruitment, around training we've been speaking about, around performance management, and even around career progression?
Yeah, so I think you see there's going to be a greater focus on risk correction and a lower tolerance for error. So when you look at work product coming out from law offices, from banking, from most professions across the board, they're looking for a reduced margin of error, less grammatical mistakes, less argument mistakes in there, stronger work product, and at a quicker pace. So you see this lower margin of error, this expected quicker pace, the expectation of a reduced cost as well, based on time savings. But you also, given all those things, they are pressures that exist out there. But AI can help with all of that. So properly integrated AI will reduce, grammatical errors, will reduce, just general errors when you're doing double checks on email, when you're double checking work product through integrations in Microsoft Office, for example. So those are all things that AI can assist with. AI, building it in as an automation in the back end to give you a breakdown of days and emails that have come through and plan out the week for you and assist with that, missed connections and responses. Those are all things and automations that can be done to enhance your workflow. What I think you're going to see as well is you're going to see those smaller and mid-size firms, and I say firms generally across markets, they're going to be able to compete with much bigger competitors because the scope of the work that they're going to be able to perform is going to be 10x, 100x, just based on the ability to process larger amounts of data, these kind of large data sets that come through, especially, in fields where it's large documented processing, for example. I'm always going to lean back to law firms in my field because it's what I know best too, across employment as well. But you're going to see a lot of ability of smaller groups to compete with some of the larger marketplace holders, just because you can build in those AI workflows and build in those tools to process data at so much greater scale and with so much greater efficiency. So you don't need to be able to fund that 100-person team to compete as a 20-person team. Um, so that ability in the marketplace is going to kind of be an equalizer across the board for those who can access it. And with the mainstream, we'll call mainstream AI, with Claude releasing different modules all the time, and ChatGPT, and all the modules that are coming out across the board for different kind of markets, you're getting a little bit more affordable ability of the smaller uh, marketplaces to compete in that greater scheme. So I think you're going to see the ability of a smaller team, a medium-sized team, compete in a large scope. So it's going to be a lot more competitive for a while, and I think that's what you're going to see expand out there.
But AI is not purely data driven. I mean, people say it's all data driven, it's objective. It's not. It's not. And we know that every algorithm reflects assumptions. It reflects historical data. It reflects human choices that have occurred for a variety of reasons. Some good, some definitely not good. Now, if an AI system influences hiring, promotion, dismissal, or produces some sort of an unfair outcome, who's responsible for that decision? And I think that's why a lot of companies are still very slow to roll out some of these tools, because they're just not sure, you know, if the software recommends it, do we follow it? Do we not follow it? Are we actually saving any money if we still need a human in the loop? How should companies be thinking about that today?
There's no circumstance in which I, as an lawyer, would ever recommend that a full decision be made or for full workflow go through without a human in the loop. And while you can use it to maximize the output of an individual, there should always be that human interaction and that human review. And where you see a lot of these issues arising, we'll talk about hiring first. In hiring, is that you have an algorithm, you have AI reasoning based on historical data and things like that, and pulling in all of this. And while statistically it's looking at one zip code versus another and saying, okay, the company has historically hired 98% of employees from this zip code. They may have a higher prevalence of graduate degrees and things of that nature. You're starting to build in those protected class violations where you would see a larger trend building out, and where you're seeing some of the larger lawsuits that are happening, like the Workday lawsuit, which is the hiring program that is built in an AI program to filter out resumes and that nature. So you'll see more and more in that until they work it through, how to properly automate, and how to make sure that this human review is always kept, the human in the loop is always there, at least in hiring for now, because that's where you're seeing a lot of the issues evolve. Um, the other piece where you see some issues is where individuals will take the AI model and force it into a decision or a pathway that supports the narrative that they want, as opposed to the recommendation. So, the Craft on Subnautica video game lawsuit that came out of Delaware Chancery, that's a big one where there was a transaction that occurred, and in that transaction, certain bonuses and things like that were negotiated based on sales of product and performance moving forward. And when everything looked on target, the acquirer had gone back and in simple terms tried to figure out how to get out of the deal, because they thought the payout to the sellers was going to be too high based on future sales. And so instead of, he went to his legal team said, there's not really any way to get you out of this in a way that you want. He turned to ChatGPT, and ChatGPT came back and said, it agreed with the legal team at first, but then he kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, as the allegations go, and pushing it into a narrative where it finally gave him a plan of what he wanted, because he had pushed it that far. And he pursued that plan, and now it's come back to bite him, as the court had disagreed with him, and put these gentlemen that sold the company that were still there back in place, and it reinstituted the bonus program. And so the risks, are not understanding the algorithm, not having a human in loop, but also not having a fundamental understanding that, at this point, you can push a model to do what you want it to do. You may have to go through, and there may be protections in place, but you can still push it through because it wants to respond to you in a way that gives you an answer of what you're looking for. So, understanding that if you push it to an extent, the data is in the output is going to degrade as you go down that kind of pathway. So understanding both ends of that, it's not infallible. Um, is a big understanding that people need to understand.
But notwithstanding that, companies have wrestled post COVID with, do we bring people into the office? How do we track performance? And it's really accelerated this use of monitoring technology. Employers are now tracking keystrokes, screenshots, browser activity, location, communications, and productivities in ways that, a few years ago would have seemed extraordinary and honestly wouldn't have been allowed. So, from your point of view, from a workplace and a labor relations aspect, where should organizations draw the line between legitimate management and supervision and excessive surveillance?
Yeah, I think there's a fine line. I think there's a extent that management needs training to, and so you need to train your managers to be good supervisors. You talked about, if the output is there and the work product is being produced by the employees, and the employees are productive, they're happy. The management training side of it should be, continuing that, being able to influence workers to be happy, to be productive, as opposed to getting into every nuance of what someone's doing throughout a day. And there are ways to build in compliance tools like we talked about earlier with kind of back end compliance using compliance APIs from these AI models. They put those tools in employers' hands to really isolate risks. You can flag items that are going to be extremely risky and things like that on the back end to alert you when that occurs so that you don't have to be in an employee's, every minute by minute. You don't have to be looking at keystrokes, the mouse trackers and movement, and making sure you don't see the yellow checkbox come up on Teams as opposed to the green or the red, because then you build that distrust in with the employees, especially remote employees that are your high performers, and in business output and revenue are what matters. So, building that distrust only makes employees want to push back. And then you get things like automated mouse tickers and things of that nature, or someone just putting in presentation mode on Teams that they can't be seen as not being away from their desk or anything like that. So you build in kind of that environment of mistrust, which slowly erodes the workplace environment, and you're going to see less production. You're going to see less satisfaction. So I think the big piece of it is the management training to make sure that managers are empowering the employees and making them feel comfortable and be able to use the tools that they have, but not be afraid to say, okay, I have, produced 10 times what I thought I was going to produce today. I'm going to take a break for a minute, and not having that fear that somebody's going to call you immediately as soon as you go yellow and away. So I think it's a training balance, but it's also a workplace environment balance where people feel that they're comfortable, they're able to talk to you, they're able to do their job without being micromanaged on such a fine, minute level.
Yeah, no, it's an important thing, and I think your point is spot on about management training. I got a new manager not long after COVID, and he made the observation that you're not in the office very much. It'd be great to see you in the office a bit more. And if you want me sitting in the office, I'll be there, and I'll be productive, and I'll be great. But there's no way I'll be as productive as if I'm doing what I do now, which is literally bouncing from client to client and meeting and engaging, which is what I'm employed to do as a management consultant. And he paused, and you could see the clogs clicking in his head, and he's like, "Let me think about it. For now, just keep working the way you work." And of course, he never came back. And we've got a great relationship, and he's an awesome manager. But you could see he was defaulting to the older school of, no, you should be at the desk. I should see you there by 8 o'clock, and I should see you still there at 5 o'clock. And but realized, actually, I'm paying Dominic for something different. I'm paying him for output, and that's where we're going to achieve productivity.
We wrestle with it as well because, like I said, law firms are slow adopters of new tech, and they're coming around the edge on that now. But you have that push of remote work versus I can see that employee in the workspace, but are they really as productive? Are they chatting with coworkers? Are they walking around the building? Are we getting coffee 10 times because I can, because it's free here? And maybe that productivity is far greater on a remote scale. And there should be no doubts about whether or not that makes sense in today's world, especially. But that communication is so important.
It is, yeah. It really makes a huge difference. And employment risk can take many different forms, but it's traditionally sat with HR and sometimes with legal. But artificial intelligence and that new domain and all the topics we've just been exploring touch on cybersecurity, on procurement, on privacy, ethics, operational resilience, corporate reputation. And this feels like something that boards should be discussing much more frequently. Who owns artificial intelligence? Who owns employment risk within the organization now? Is it the board? Is it HR, legal, IT, procurement, or the CEO? So, who do you speak to? Who do you want to be advising when it comes to these topics when they walk into your office?
Everyone. AI implementation is unlike almost any other program in human history, and it really is such this progressive technology. But it's so integrated in everything that you do in a workplace that the board should be the one discussing it overall. They should be discussing implementation and risk at the company, wide scale enterprise level. Where can we integrate? Where can we automate? What makes sense in the company's direction looking forward next year, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road? Large scale implementation of that, especially at the cost that AI implementation can incur across a large enterprise, because you don't want a fringe group at a company, the sales team be going out there and pulling out external, ChatGPT and throwing in client data in their potential client list and things like that.
Good. No, I think you're right. Everyone needs to be engaging, and boards, even if they're not AI native, the boards need to start understanding it. They need to bring in external advisors who can advise them on it, and so then they can be making the relevant decisions around these important topics. And we're moving, and I think we've talked about that, Andrew. We're moving into this world where AI won't simply change jobs; it'll change that relationship between employers and employees. So we have a lot of founders, CEOs, board members that listen to this podcast, Andrew, right across North America, right across Europe. So for these founders and business leaders that are listening to us today, if they could just take 3 practical steps over the next 12 months to prepare their organization for AI in the workplace, to prepare their employees, what would you tell them to prioritize?
So if there's three things, the first would be learning. So learn about the basics of AI and how it affects your industry. There's a wealth of information out there, especially across the board on, whether it's YouTube, whether it's a podcast like this, where we're talking about how to implement AI and how it affects certain industries. So that's the first learning piece. And the second piece would be training. That's, fundamental across the board, no matter the size of your company, wherever you are in the life cycle, AI is going to come into play. Not only in, training your workforce about it, but showing those training programs and having that kind of robust AI training in your company in place when someone looks at it externally. So training your people on use and compliance. And I would say that the third piece is implementation. In order to, we'll say appease to an extent, but give those tools in place for employees, you have to implement it in some format. So whether or not it's saying, okay, we have the Microsoft ecosystem, there's Copilot in there, or you have Cloud Enterprise or Grok or ChatGPT, whatever you're putting in place, have something in place for your employees to use, because they're going to want to use it, and they're going to use it on the side if they don't have access to it in one format or another. You need to have some tools in place for your employees to use, or else they're going to try and do it externally and look for some other pathway to use it. So, those are the three things I always look at, is learning, training, and then implementation of some form.
Fantastic. And Andrew, one question that we ask all guests that come on the International Risk podcast is, when you look around the world at everything that's going on today, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
So I think, in my world, the risk that we see is that implementation across the board, that failure to train successors. So thinking that, with any great invention, there becomes an over reliance on something, and then you start cutting out pieces where you can't. So the risk for us globally is, I think, that lack of succession training across all industries for that next level, that next generation of employees across the board. And then that failure to train on the risk and the data coming outside of your controls, which always concerns me whenever I'm talking to someone, is what are you putting into a model that is training on that data, and what is your understanding of what's happening there?
Thanks for sharing that. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that was a great conversation with Andrew Adams. He's the chair of the Labour and Employment Practice Group at Darrow Everett. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening to the podcast today. We'll speak again in the next few days.